Okay, in this video tutorial, we're going to talk about how to render a scene in the most kind of simple way possible. And then in the next video tutorial, I'm going to show how we can start to incorporate render layers to take it to the next level here. So to start off, we have workspace and we're in a general workspace. And so I'm going to go down and choose rendering standard. That's going to change the layout a little bit. And so moving from right to left, you should see render settings right here. And if you don't see render settings, it's this button where my cursor is. And so we'll kind of go over that first in a minute once we go over the interface. So next I have the camera perspective. And so you can see I had previously created a camera in my scene and I had locked it. So to lock the camera, I pressed that button in order to lock it into place. And so it's really important when you're rendering not to render out of your perspective view, because with the camera, you can do things like set your focal length, you can lock the camera, you can animate it for scenes. And so it's just really a good practice to learn how to create a camera and set that up. So if you're not sure how to do that, you can look at one of my previous tutorials. Moving down, we have the script editor. And so sometimes when batch rendering, this will give you a readout of information in terms of what percentage of your render is done and give you some helpful information there through the rendering process. And then over here's the outliner, so where we can select objects and see it in the outliner, and this becomes really helpful when we use render layers under the render setup panel. And again, the next tutorial will go over how to use this panel correctly. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is under render settings, we need to set this up. And so the first thing I need to do, just starting under the common tab, right? We have all these tabs under render settings. So we're going to start under the common tab. And we're just going to move from the top to the bottom. So at the very top, you can see it says path. And then you can see it's on my desktop. This is the name of my project folder. And then this is going into my images folder. So that's great. If this doesn't show your project, just be sure to set your project. So go to File and then Set Project and make sure your project is set up correctly at that point. So if that looks good, then great. So next up, we're going to name this. So I'm just going to call this Online Demo. And for the image format, so I click on that and we have a bunch of options. And I prefer TIFF. So I'm going to render out a TIFF. And so when you render a TIFF, you have this option. So that's something to take a look at. So, but by default, a TIFF will render out an alpha channel. And what an alpha channel means is just a transparency. If there's nothing there, it'll be transparent. And so you can see that I have my models there, but there's nothing really behind it. That's just my sky dome light. And so if I were to render this out with that just by default, not checked, then there will be a transparency layer behind it. One thing in my scene is I have some atmosphere in my scene. And I'm not sure if I want an alpha channel. So if I click on render, it looks like this. And so you can see this gradient from my atmosphere. And I kind of like it the way it is. So I might not want that alpha channel. Most of the time you're going to want that. If your sky dome is still showing up in your render, be sure to turn that off. And so you can see I have my sky dome light back here. And I'd already taken care of this previously, but if your sky dome's showing up right now in your Arnold render, be sure to click on your sky dome like that, go to the attribute editor, and under sky dome, we have the color of the sky dome, its intensity, and then we just scroll down to this, there you should see a visibility tab. And under visibility, if it's up like that at 1, your sky dome will show up in the background. And I'm really generally not a fan of that. And so again, just under the visibility, just take that down to 0 and it won't show up. Okay, so with that aside out of the way, let's get back to the render settings. So I've decided to skip the alpha. I don't want an alpha channel on this. But again, if you want to composite your scene later on, it's usually a really good idea to have that turned off. Moving down, we're just going to render a single frame. So name extension single frame is a good option here. For future reference, if you're trying to render out an animation, you're just going to click on this, and then you're going to go to name, number, and extension. And this is going to be the range. So right now it's just going to start at frame 1 and end at frame 10. If I want to render out a 30 frame animation, I would type 30 right there, and I would render out an animation that way. But again, we're just doing a single frame today, so the single frame option is fine. Continue to move down. Remember, I set up a camera and I locked it before. And so by default, it's rendering your perspective view, which is not good. So I just want to make sure that's rendering the camera. Continue to move down. So right here, we're going to set what resolution this is going to render at. So by default, it's set at HD 540, so 960 by 540. And that's a pretty low resolution. That's basically SD. And the reason that Maya does that is so that when you're working, you can kind of render in real time and not have a bunch of problems with lag while you're modeling your project. So what I recommend doing is you could either click on this, and really at a minimum, I think the absolute minimum you should do is HD 1080. Right there you can type in 1920 by 1080, and that's the standard HD resolution. And usually if I'm kicking out just one rendered still image, I want this to be something I can throw in my portfolio and have be at the maximum resolution. So something in that range of 4K I think is probably preferable. And unfortunately, they don't really have any really good 4K presets in here. Like they have 4K square, but it's just 4096 by 4096. You know, that can be fine. One thing to remember is the normal 4K render is you just take 1920 by 1080 and you multiply it by 2. And so that's 3840 by 2160. Right, so that would be a good resolution to aim for. And this render, you know, it might take 5 or 10 minutes, but it's just one image that we're kicking out, right? Since this is just an online demo and I want this to be able to kind of keep moving, even though I recommend a resolution like this, I'm going to move this back down to HD 1080 just for this demonstration. So from here, we could go ahead and render things out, but I just want to give you one more layer of information here before we render. So that's the common tab. So that's everything you need to change in the common tab. And it's really important to kind of make all those changes that I outlined there. And so under the Arnold render, we have what's up here. And I'll go over this in just a moment. But we also have, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's this tab called Imagers. And so turn that on. And so in one of the more recent versions of Maya, they recently added a denoiser by default. So as long as you're on the most recent version of Maya, you should be good here. But if your renders are showing up grainy, it might be because this somehow got turned off, or maybe in your version of Maya it's just not on automatically. And so let me just show that real quick. So I'm in the Arnold render. And if the denoiser, and again this is hidden under Imagers, is turned off, you'll see that there's going to be like a graininess to the render. It's still kind of working through, but it's still just going to look a little bit clunky in some of these sections. And so if your render is looking a little bit noisy or clunky, this might be an area to fix. And so maybe this just got turned off, and so to turn it back on, you can click that right there, and that'll enable it again. And if this is empty, like nothing's there, just go to Add Imager, and then add Denoiser Nice, and that'll add a denoiser algorithm onto your render and kind of clean it up and make it look a little bit nicer. So that's a really important section to know about, be aware of, and all that. And so moving up here, we have the sampling. And so each of these sliders is an individual slider that just kind of boosts, that you can use to boost different parameters of your render. So camera AA is anti-aliasing. And so by default, it should be set at 3. And this is probably the slider here that, in my experience, yields the most results. And so if you really want to kind of boost up your render a little bit, maybe you take this from 3 to 4. I highly recommend being conservative with how you boost these, though. The difference from like 3 to 4, or in some of these other cases like 2 to 3, can be pretty helpful, but it's pretty diminishing returns after that, right? So if I take this from 3 to 4, it might boost my render, a decent amount. But if I take this from like 4 to 5, my render times are going to go up a lot more, and it's going to be pretty negligible, the amount of difference that happens, right? So just keep in mind that as I move these sliders up, maybe you move these up just by 1 or something, but if you move it up too much, it's going to really boost your render times, and it's not even going to make too big of a difference. Okay, so Typically, I'll take camera A and I might boost that from 3 to 4. So again, that's anti-aliasing. So we have diffuse, so that's the quality of the color channel. We have specular, so that's the quality of like these little white highlights that you might see right there. So, you know, maybe you could boost that from 2 to 3. Again, I'm going to keep these settings kind of low because, again, this is an online demo. And I want this render to kind of move quickly so that I don't slow things down too much for you guys. So transmission is the quality of like glass renders, essentially. SSS refers to subsurface scattering, and that's something that's more relevant if you're rendering like a candle or a character and you're using subsurface shaders. Volume indirect is the number of times a light ray bounces within the scene. So if you have an environment that has a lot going on in it, like a room or something like that, you might want to boost this up from 2 to 3. Since this is an online demo and since this is just a car on a platform, I'm going to keep this low for here. So again, you might not need to mess with this too much, but I think it is important to just kind of understand the basics of this Arnold Renderer tab and how to kind of boost things around right here. So with all that being said, we're now ready to render. And so when you're ready to render, you can go to, remember we're under the workspace's rendering standard. So I go to render and then render sequence and click on this options button. And just be sure when you click on this, and it's really important to click that options button, make sure that it's going to render out of your camera. And I like to have this enabled, and this is just render layers enabled, and that'll become relevant when we get into the next video where we get into some more advanced stuff. And so with all that set, we're just going to go render sequence and close, and this render will begin. So our render is done. And so where this should show up, let's double check this. So I'll go into my Finder window and go under Desktop. So this is my project, and it should go into your Images folder. And there's my render.